Good afternoon, everyone, or perhaps good morning or good evening to those who are listening from afar. My name is Kristin Hausler, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this live webinar on behalf of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. Today, we will be discussing the Ratline, Philippe Sands' fascinating new book. As some of you will know, the book brings a new dimension to the BBC podcast of the same name, which brought to light the story of Nazi Governor Otto Wächter, who was indicted but never prosecuted for his crimes. The discussion will focus on some of the key legal issues raised by the book, including the challenges of prosecuting alleged perpetrators of international crimes and issues of impunity. Of course, while many fled from justice following the Second World War, despite the trials at Nuremberg, the prosecution of those alleged to have committed international crimes remains challenging to this day. And we can, of course, think of the ongoing investigation now of Myanmar before the International Criminal Court. And that makes today, of course, today's webinar even more relevant. We are very fortunate today to have the author of the Ratline with us, Philippe Sands, QC, who is Professor of Law at UCL and a practicing barrister at Matrix Chambers. He frequently appears before international courts and has been involved in a number of cases which were concerned with international crimes such as Pinochet, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and of course, more recently, the case of the Rohingya in Myanmar, but before the International Court of Justice. Many of you will have read East-West Street, which won the Bailey Gifford Prize. And we are equally fortunate today to have with us Rebecca Abrams, who is herself an award-winning author, as well as a journalist who regularly contributes to the Financial Times. Her most recent books include The Jewish Journey, 4,000 Years in 22 Objects, as well as a historical novel entitled Touching Distance. She's currently working on a novel about radicalization and nationalism, as well as on a play which focuses on the murder of a Russian writer by Stalin. Rebecca teaches at the University of Oxford, where she is the Royal Literary Fund Fellow at Brasenose College, and she's also a recipient of Amnesty International Prize for Journalism. Now, before I hand it over to Rebecca and Philippe, I wanted to let you all know that you can also participate in the webinar, so please use the question box, type in your question as we go along, and my colleague, Dr. Jean-Pierre Gauci, and I will read your questions and pass them on to the panelists once the conversation has concluded. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Kristin, and hello, Philippe, and it's a very great pleasure and honour to be interviewing you today about your wonderful book. I've just been rereading it again, in fact, in the lead up to this, and was really struck, you know, as a novelist, by kind of what a fast-paced thriller it is, apart from everything else. But you say you described it yourself as in a recent article as a world that you uncovered in this book, in the Ratline, a world of espionage and escape, of double dealing and duplicity, of exhumations and reburials. 4 years of research took you from Austria to Rome, to Syria, to South America, took you into monasteries, over lakes, across mountains, into the shadowy world of the Ratline. Which of course is the escape route used by Nazis to travel from Italy to Argentina. I was sort of struck really that that East-West Street, which took us sort of up to and beyond the Nuremberg trials and the establishment of the laws around the laws that we have today around crimes against humanity as well as genocide. This book, in a sense, goes in the other direction. It sort of parts company with that book and follows the people who never did come to trial, who managed to escape and evade justice. It's a book, above all for me, it's a book about doubles, double dealing and duplicity, but it's also, there are doubles in the characters. There's the father and the son, there's the story of a life and an afterlife, there's the story of a double quest. There's your quest and the quest of Otto Vector, and there's a double evasion. There's the Otto Vector, who evades trial, and then his son, who evades the truth about his father. And of course, many of the people that you tracked down themselves were leading double lives. So I think I just wanted to begin, in a sense, by asking you, how much of this did you have any idea of when you started out on this book? And what did start you out on this particular journey?
Sure, sure. Well, Rebecca, firstly, it's incredibly nice to be doing this with you. For those who are watching, and hello, BIICL, thank you again for having me back. It's a big supporter of the Institute, and I hope everyone who's watching is also. International law is incredibly important at this moment, and we should all be caring passionately about its well-being. But for those who are on and don't know, I don't really know Rebecca. I know her by reputation. I know some of her work, but she'd written a very generous review, and I reached out after that review because the review gave me insights into things that I hadn't appreciated about my own writing. It's one of the great things of writing is people who read your writing see things that the writer doesn't necessarily see, and your introduction has framed things already in a very interesting way. I mean, the book was like East West Street, sort of an accident. It grew out of East West Street. If I hadn't done East West Street, I wouldn't have done the Ratline. Otto Wächter is a minor character in East West Street, and in writing East West Street, one of the characters was Hans Frank, who had been Hitler's personal lawyer in the late 20s and then Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, and then one of the defendants, and a fascinating, sort of nefarious character. And I came to know his son, Nicholas, who was a very distinguished journalist. And one day Nicholas said to me, you're interested in Lemberg, you should meet, if you want, the son of the governor of Lemberg, who was my father's deputy, Otto Wächter, and his son Horst is someone I know, maybe he'll meet you. And one thing led to another, and we met. And that was back in early 2012. And I was sort of fascinated by Horst, immediately fascinated, because unlike Nicholas, who detests his father, first thing Nicholas ever said to me was, I need you to know, Philippe, that I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father, which is a pretty tremendous opening line. And it really happened. We went down and met Horst, and Horst was different. Horst said at the outset, look, I'm not like Nicholas. I look for the good in my father. He was involved, I know, in terrible things, but he was never convicted, and he's not a criminal. And those words were interesting for me because as an international lawyer, formal systems of justice are important to me, but I know they leave gaps, and into those gaps sneak people like Otto Wächter. And Horst's line to me was, Philippe, he was never tried, he was never convicted. When he died in 1949 in curious circumstances, he died an innocent man. So from my perspective, being interested in international criminal justice, I was curious about the space this absence of a legal proceeding created. He was indicted, he was hunted, or he believed himself to be hunted, but he was never caught. And I was equally interested at the human level of what legacy that leaves for the next generation in the family and the next generation but one, and so on and so forth. Because this question, was my father a criminal, absolutely haunts Horst.
I will come back to those very, very important questions in a moment. I wonder whether it would be useful for listeners to just fill in a little bit about Otto Wächter. He was a very high-ranking member of the SS. Could you just explain a little bit about who he was and what his role was during the war within the Nazi apparatus?
Sure. He was Austrian. He was born in 1901. He studied at the University of Vienna Law School, which he entered in October 1919, unbelievably on the same day as Hersch Lauterpacht, who was the subject of East West Street, the sort of inventor, if you like, of crimes against humanity as a legal term back in 1945, and whose family, the family of Lauterpacht, he will then be involved in the killing of, as he was in relation to my grandfather's family. So there is a very personal element here. He's crossing lines already when he's 20 years old. There are maybe amongst you watching this students. In his first year at law school, he went on an anti-Jewish demonstration, broke windows, beat up Jews, and ended up in jail for a week. In 1923, he joins the Austrian branch of the National Socialist Party. So he's very much a true and early believer. He qualifies as a lawyer, he goes into commercial practice, and on the side, he does cases for Nazis in Austria. And in that context, he becomes more and more politically involved. And in 1934, he leads the coup attempt against the Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss and flees Vienna for Berlin. By then he is married. He has met Charlotte in 1929, and they already have 2 children. We can come back to Charlotte later. She stays in Vienna. He goes to Berlin. She joins him in Berlin. to give you a flavor of the kind of relationship they had, on arrival in Berlin, she discovers that he is having an affair with a young woman called Traute, and Traute is quickly dispatched, but so is, she's pregnant and she has an abortion to penalize him for his misdemeanor. And even worse, a year later, when she falls pregnant and has a child, she names the child, who is a girl, Traute, in honor of the mistress. That should serve you right, she tells Otto. So you get a sense of the relationship between the two of them. And then, of course, in 1938, Germany invades Austria. And she goes back on the first day. She brings him back, and they stand together on the balcony overlooking the Heldenplatz, within 1 meter of Adolf Hitler. So they are absolutely top table. He has spent his time in Berlin. He has come into the circle of Heinrich Himmler, who loved lawyers and used a lot of lawyers to do his dirty work across Europe. It's a very interesting theme that has never really been fully explored. They were seen as absolutely reliable. And then he's up the greasy pole. His first job is in the Austrian Nazi government, directed really from Berlin, removing Jews from public office. A year later, in October 1939, he is posted to Krakow. He becomes the governor of Krakow, where he's responsible for rounding up Polish intellectuals and identifying and ghettoizing Jews. And 2 years later, he is moved to Lemberg, to District Galicia, where he becomes governor there and oversees, if you like, the application of the final solution in District Galicia. By 1945, he's been posted to Italy. He is by then indicted for mass murder, crimes against humanity, and genocide. But when the war ends, he disappears off the face of the earth. And in the first 4 or 5 years that I knew Horst, I was never much interested in what happened afterwards. That only came later.
So, I mean, yes, I mean, he did manage to kind of successfully evade justice from 1945 until his death. 4 years later, was it 4 years later? Yeah. And I wondered whether it would be worth also just explaining how that was even possible. You know, how did he? Because you go on the trail in immense detail, and in fact, at the end of towards the end of the time that you're writing the book, you actually retrace his steps, don't you? So, I mean, I thought it would be. Just what are the mechanisms by which somebody with that visible, that well known, whose actions are that well documented, how can somebody like that just escape and disappear like that?
I mean, that, for me, in a sense, is one of the most fascinating aspects of all of this. So Horst, very early, well, actually midway through our relationship, in about 2015, gave me access to the entire family archive, 10,000 pages, which took 4 years with some wonderful PhD students and LLM students with linguistic skills that I don't have and historical skills that I don't have. We went through the material, guided in part by the great Lisa Jardine, who sadly is no longer with us. And as we got into that material, it became clear that just as fascinating as the crimes he committed was the act of disappearance in 1945. He literally disappears off the face of the earth. And we got to the heart of the whole story. He was in Austria the day the war ended, the collapse, Charlotte calls it, and he meets a young SS soldier called Buko Hartmann, who is a member of the 24th Waffen-SS Kastjäger Division, mountain killers. They've spent time in Italy and Yugoslavia killing partisans and killing villagers, actually, in mass atrocities. And Hartmann knows how to survive at great heights in the mountains. And he says to Wächter, I'll take you to a place where the British and the Americans who are hunting you are too lazy and too stupid to go, which is up 2,000 meters up in the mountains. We'll hide in huts and we won't come down. And for 3.5 years, they live in the mountains of Austria, very, very high, close to Charlotte, who goes to see them every 2 or 3 weeks. And I've been to those places. I mean, extraordinary that she would bring them provisions and clothes and food and newspapers. And remarkably, they're following the Nuremberg trial from a great height because she's bringing them newspapers. How do I know that? There was a moment late in 2016, December 2016, when I said to Horst, tell me about Burkhard Hartmann. I'm curious to know what motivated him and why he did what he did. And I asked lots of questions, and Horst said, well, I can answer all of your questions, or we could telephone Buko. And I was pretty floored by that because it was 2016 and that was 71 years ago. And it never even occurred to me that Boko Haram could still be alive, but he was. And we arranged to go and see him 6 weeks later in Germany. He imposed one condition for seeing him, again, back to the theme of justice, which was that I not ask a single question about what he did before the 9th of May, 1945. And in due course, I accepted the condition, of course. I wanted to see him. And his daughter, who was there, explained that he imposed the condition because he was involved in acts which he thought might expose him to criminal indictment, and he worried to the end of his life that he could be arrested for the crimes he'd committed in Italy and Yugoslavia. And from him, and it was possibly one of the most remarkable encounters I've ever had, and I've had a few interesting ones, to be with someone who was with Wächter for 3.5 years in the mountains and could describe how a day was spent, how they walked around, how they hid, and how finally they left, and how Wächter decided on leaving he would make his way to South America on what is now known as the Ratline. So that was beyond fascinating. Frankly, equally fascinating was a little photograph on Burkhard Ratman's bookshelf behind his shoulder as I was interviewing him. It was extremely distracting. You know, you do cases in court, you do cross-examinations, and you're absolutely focused. But behind Burkhard Ratman on his bookshelf, it's rather like your bookshelf you have behind you. Imagine there's a little round photograph, and you can't quite see what it is, and you're in conversation for 5 hours. And finally, when it's all over, you go and see it, and you look at the little photograph, and it's Adolf Hitler on Hartmann's bookshelf in 2017. So I thought that spoke rather loudly of where his interests lay.
There are so many sort of chilling moments like that with photographs, aren't there? Like Horst Wächter has the picture of Arthur, his godfather,
Seyss-Inquart, yeah, his godfather,
on his bedside table. You know, and again, there's a astonishing lack of shame or embarrassment or self-awareness even, but that these things might be deeply offensive to other people. And it's again one of the strands running through the book that I found really interesting.
Well, I mean, for the students on this webinar, of course, they will know the name Arthur Seyss-Inquart because he was defended in the famous Nuremberg trial, and he was convicted and he was hanged. And at a certain moment, I said to Horst, "Why do you have a photograph, a big photograph of Seyss-Inquart right next to your bed?" And he said, "Because he was my grandfather, my godfather." I mean, interestingly, it's really interesting for me. The book has come out simultaneously in Dutch, and because of the Seyss-Inquart link, it has gone into the bestseller list, which of course I didn't imagine happening. So one of the interesting things is how these names, Seyss-Inquart, Wächter, at a sort of societal level, but also at a family level, they continue to raise issues 70 years later. Justice has a very long arm, it might be said, or injustice.
But also it seems sort of not quite long enough, because I mean, one of the extraordinary things you discover about Otto Vector was that having sort of gone on this escape route, sort of living and surviving in the mountains for 3 years, he then lands up in Rome, where he's been indicted in 45 with the help of the Americans. But then it turns out what you discover is that he's being shielded in Rome by various people with the full knowledge of the Americans.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't invent it. And this is where, for me, who teaches international criminal law and international courts, and we assume that our system of criminal justice, you know, is something governments care about. Welcome to the real world, everybody, because what I stumbled across, and it's not an area I am expert in, absolutely. I had to go and speak to some remarkable people, Professor Norman Goder in Florida, Professor David Kurtzer, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his book on Mussolini and the Pope, who taught me a whole lot. And of course, I have the wonderful happiness of having as one of my neighbors where I live, the writer John le Carre, because I'd stumbled into the world he knew about, the world of espionage. And I went to see him, and I rang him up and said, "Look, it's a bit confusing. I've come into your domain. I don't know about the Cold War. I don't know about espionage and recruiting people." He said, "Send me a few documents about Wächter. I'll do a bit of research. Come and have tea, bring some cakes." So I went over, and he had everything neatly laid out, le Carre. And he said, this is fascinating. I said, oh yes. He said, it's fascinating because I was there in 49. I said, what do you mean you were there in 49? He said, I was an 18-year-old English soldier, and I was in Austria, and my job was to interrogate Germans in the camps. And I said, for what purpose? To prosecute them if you found criminals or people you believed had committed crimes. He said, oh, we found plenty of people who committed crimes, but I wasn't after them to prosecute them. I said, what? He said, I was after them to recruit them because we had a new enemy, which was the Soviets, and they knew where the communists were, and we recruited them. And what happened, I asked, when you came across a file of someone who'd committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, participated in genocide? He said, we lost the files. It was very, very simple. We had a principle called Persilschein, Persil, which is the detergent, the laundry detergent, washes whiter than white. And these people would get a Persilschein certificate. And that was the moment, of course, which the scales fell from my eyes on the nature of the international criminal justice system and the symbolism of Nuremberg, which was only very partial in its consequence. It was a real eye-opener, I have to say, to learn the reality of the international criminal justice system. And it works just like that today, frankly.
I mean, it is an astonishing window onto this sort of a conflict or tension between, as you say, realpolitik and law. On the other, and the two are on a collision course very often, aren't they? And what happened in Rome in the last 3 months of Otto Wächter's life was that, in fact, a lot of the people who he felt were shielding him, you found, in fact, had already been recruited by the Americans and were on their payroll and were protecting him for quite complicated reasons, certainly not for one single reason. I wondered what you felt about the complicity of people like that, and how far they should remain beyond the reach of the law, or whether more could be done to kind of bring them within it.
I felt deeply conflicted. This is a book, in a sense, you'll have appreciated that, in a sense, could only really be written by someone with academic connections, because it means you've got a question like the one you're asking, and you find who is the best academic who can teach you, who can take you through the archives and the materials and find them. Professor Goda in Florida is probably, I think it's fair to say, the world's leading expert on the US archives, on US engagement with Nazis in the post-war period. So he sent me a document dating to 1957 called Project Los Angeles, which blew my mind, I have to say. And what that disclosed was that in 1947, the Americans in Austria and Italy decided they were going to create a spy network to confront the Soviet threat, the communist, the Bolshevik threat in Italy, which was seen as a sort of beachhead for Soviet expansionist ambitions, as they feared. And that document, the top secret La Vista report, it's now in the public domain, disclosed that the Americans hired a chief agent in the area who was a very senior Nazi called Karl Haas, who was a former SS officer and actually a former comrade of Otto Wächter's, and who was now living in Italy and who had been involved in terrible things. 50 years later, in the 1990s, Haas would be sentenced to pretty much to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity, for the largest mass killing that has ever happened on the territory of Italy, if there are any Italians watching in the killings in the Fosse Ardeatine in Rome. And underneath Karl Haas was a network of 8 sub-agents. 3 were members of the Italian Fascist Party, and not just anyone. The Secretary General of the Italian Fascist Party was an American agent, $50 a month. 3 other senior Nazi intelligence officers, all criminals or indicted individuals, US agents, and most staggering of all, 2 very senior Vatican officials, a bishop called Alois Hudal, who of course was deeply implicated in the Ratline, and in a sense most startling of all for me, although he doesn't play a role in the story, Pope Pius XII's personal press spokesperson, chief press spokesperson, was a US agent paid $50 a month. So the network is unbelievable, and it gives you a sense of, again, the real world in the face of efforts to create a rule of law system.
In fact, the story with Haas goes, becomes even murkier, doesn't it? Because it turns out he's not only working for the Americans. Isn't that right?
Haas was then let go in 1951 because he was considered to be a double agent for the Soviets. And of course, this is a fact that Horst Wächter has seized on and cannot get out of his mind in the belief that his father was poisoned in 1949, and he thinks probably poisoned by Karl Haas, although actually his alternative theory is that Wächter, his father, was poisoned by the Jews, and in particular by Simon Wiesenthal, whose memoir amazingly mentions and fingers Otto Wächter as the man who killed Simon Wiesenthal's mother by having her deported to Belzec extermination camp. So it is an extraordinarily murky cast of characters. And what you get to is this remarkable situation, which of course was a real eye-opener for me, which is that at the same time that Wächter is being hunted by the Americans to be prosecuted for crimes against humanity and genocide, he's also the subject of a recruitment effort. In other words, two different branches of government are working and pulling in opposite directions. Not unusual in government even today, but seeing it in black and white was pretty remarkable.
I mean, by recruiting former Nazis as spies and informants for America in exchange for safe passage out of Europe or protection or being hidden in Europe, I mean, that you could argue that the Americans effectively enabled these individuals to evade justice. I mean, then
totally.
So,
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
What is there? Is there anything that legal structures can do about this?
Well, there's of course a theme underlying the entirety of the book. It's not articulated in an explicit or a legalistic way, and that is the question of complicity. When terrible things happen and people who are around others who commit terrible things, what is the responsibility of those people? For example, Otto Wächter's wife, Charlotte, who obviously knew everything that was going on and sort of egged him on, I think it's fair to say, and turned a blind eye in all of her memoirs, in all of her writings after the war, to all the horrors that had happened. What is her responsibility? What is the responsibility of a partner or a wife when your husband or your wife is engaged in acts of mass murder? And in many respects, what was sort of striking in some of the personal correspondence, I mean, to go back to Lisa Jardine, her interest in this project was that she'd given, I first came across Lisa, she'd given an inaugural lecture at UCL called Temptation in the Archives. I love archives, and I love sort of ferreting around in archives, looking for documents and interpreting them and seeing what things mean. You always have to have an open mind because nothing's ever quite what it seems. But Lisa Jardine's, one of her big theses was that to understand really what happens in life, go to the personal material, not the governmental material, not the historical documents, because it's in the personal material, the diaries, the letters, the private photographs, that you will understand the truth of what is going on. And that's really been borne out by this project. For example, there's a letter of the 17th of December, 1939. Wächter is in Krakow. He writes to his wife, tells her he's having a marvelous time. The Vienna Philharmonic has come to visit. There are concerts, there's opera, bit of trouble with some of the Polish intellectuals, bit of trouble with some of the Jews. And then there's a line in the letter where he says, tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. Just in a letter home from Krakow to Zell am See, innocuously, but pretty open. She knew what was going on. And I think that raises this issue of complicity, and the focus that your question directs in the same way is, what about those who knew exactly where the Mengelers and the Eichmanns and the Wächters were, and not only did nothing about it, but may have been involved in helping them to get to South America and safety? And that is a very, very big question at a legal level, and of course, even more significantly, at a moral or a philosophical level. What is our responsibility?
The story of Charlotte, or Charlotte, as it's translated in the book, is very central, because you had access to a huge amount of personal information about her through her diaries, through her letters, through photographs she kept. I mean, there was a massive archive, thousands of documents. And I think, again, that issue of complicity is very, very interesting in relation to her story, because it's quite clear she did know, and there's a kind of she did know what her husband was doing. She herself was actively involved in looting art from the museum in Krakow. I think that's right, isn't it? And she, as well as other possessions from the houses that they acquired along the way. And there's one very chilling moment in the book where you quote a moment where she, just after the Anschluss, where essentially it seems that Otto Wächter is sort of saying to her, look, I can either go back to just being a kind of a lawyer back home, or I can carry on this journey that I'm on and go right to the heart of things. You know, and she just says, do whatever you want, I'm right behind you. And there is an extraordinary moment in the sense, as you say, it's like a Macbethian pact, isn't it? I mean, she's really absolutely right there with him in this.
She loves the baubles. I mean, they acquire a magnificent villa in Vienna. They acquire a magnificent house overlooking Zell am See. December 1939, she's in Krakow, an extraordinary city. Many people who are watching this will have been to Krakow, will know what an extraordinary place it is, with an extraordinary national museum. And imagine, you know, you, Rebecca, your husband becomes governor of London, and he gives you a letter and says, you may go to the National Gallery and you can take anything you want. And that's what happens. Otto gives her a letter saying she can go to the National Museum and she can take anything she wants to bring home to decorate the house, which of course they then keep quite a lot of the stuff. And she turns up there, and we know about this because a diligent director of the museum then writes an affidavit in 1946 for the Allies to describe the young, attractive brunette who turned up on the morning of December 1939 with a letter saying she could take anything she wanted. And she turned up with lots of soldiers, and he was powerless. And they took some pretty serious stuff, some of which has never been recovered. And of course, what I discover in the long relationship with Horst is that he will say to me, yes, well, of course, whenever there were 6 children of the Wächters, and whenever one of us got married, he said, mother would give us a gift. And the gift was some sort of looted art item that had been taken from Krakow or from Lemberg or from some other place. And indeed, I think some of the remaining siblings, there are a couple of sisters who are still alive, I think they have some of the items still today. Horst has given everything back, actually. His encounter with me has encouraged him to give everything back, although we're having a bit of a spat right now because in Vienna, his mother acquired a place called the Villa Mendel, owned by this sort of, bakery owner who had a wonderful collection of art and other things. And she helped herself not only to the house, but to all of the art. And Horst still has a tea set, which belonged to Bettina Mendel. And Bettina Mendel's daughter, who is now an elderly lady in Brisbane, Australia, having read my stuff, wants it back. And I'm sort of the intermediary trying to arrange for this material to be transferred from Austria to Australia in 2020. You couldn't really invent it.
The whole purpose of restitution is something that interests me very much. I'm also interested in the fact that in German, the word is for restitution, I think, is Wiedergutmachen, or good making. And I wondered to what extent you feel that restitution, financial compensation, these kind of things are a worthwhile form of making good, not only for the victims, but also for the descendants of the perpetrators. I mean, in a way, this goes back to the question, the point you made earlier, which is that because he escaped trial, Otto escaped trial, in his son's eyes, he's still innocent. So I wondered if restitution as well is a way of actually making real things that people, for various reasons, don't want to acknowledge as real.
I mean, this really raises a fundamental question about the function of the criminal justice system. And I'm focused here on the international level. And I've come to the view, I haven't always thought, I've now come to the view that the function of these international criminal courts for Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, Nuremberg, they're about storytelling in large part. They are about setting a narrative, which then means people have to accept that certain things happened. Next, they are about punishment of particular individuals. And beyond that, they are also about ensuring that items that have been looted or purloined or obtained unlawfully are returned to their rightful owners. And this, of course, is an enormously complex issue. And we're living through this in Britain today with the destruction of statues in relation to Black Lives Matters, or claims for objects that may rest in the British Museum that were acquired perfectly lawfully 200 years ago, but the provenance of which today raises at the very least moral issues, but also legal issues. And of course, we have, the big issue that frankly faces the United Kingdom that no one wants to engage in is responsibility for slavery. How do we account for what happened? The slavery and the slave trade was not illegal 200 years ago, and it became illegal subsequently. Can you apply these laws retroactively? That raises questions of compensation. There are some people who feel very strongly there ought to be compensation for the slave trade. Restitution is a sort of halfway house. It's the return of objects that have been taken, and that I think is very, very important. Although actually I'm involved right now in a very interesting project with the Getty Museum in the United States in Los Angeles, with also the former director of the British Museum, Neil McGregor, on competing conceptions of ownership. Who owns property? Does it have to be an individual? Could it be a community? Could it be the international community as a whole? And the question that you raise is one that entire year-long academic seminars are devoted to. We're only touching on the surface. But this question, in the context of the Wächters, has become hugely important. And as I said, right now, Horst and I are having a bit of a spat about this tea set, because I believe passionately this lady wants it back, and we have to give it back to her. He has to give it back to her. I will help him take the steps to get it back, but that she doesn't want compensation. She just wants her mum's tea set back. And that's touching, 80 years later, that's very, very touching. And that is the same in many of these conflicts. There's nothing, I think one of the reasons I've been attracted to this story is that it's a universal theme. I mean, sure, I'm talking about Poles and Germans and Ukrainians and Jews and Italians, but actually it's universal. Yugoslavia, Rwanda, South America, Kosovo, Cambodia, you've got exactly the same issues. They are universal issues that touch all communities and all human beings.
So let's talk about denial, because your relation, one of the strangest, in the book about collaborators, lots of collaborators in this book, and one of the strangest collaborations of all at the heart of the book is your collaboration with Otto Wächter, a man who to this day does not want to, insists on not seeing his father as a bad man. He insists in seeing him as a good man. And I felt that it was this portrayal of self-deception and denial, which is just, it's so powerful in the context of all the legal stuff that's going on as well, all the officialdom, the ways in which you can get at people. It's very, you pursue Otto Wächter, you pursue him with the facts. At one point he challenges you to give him evidence. You give him so much evidence that his father was involved in mass murder directly and responsible and culpable, and he will not see it. And he said, I think at one point you say that for him it was a way, that his denial is a way of being able to live. It's a means of survival. But of course, it's not a survival that's without costs for Horst himself. I mean, he is. There are definitely costs for him of finding that particular way to survive. But for me, what it got at was how the problem, which is that crimes against humanity don't occur only at the level of states and governments. And at the level of actions, they also take place in the depths of people's hearts and minds. And it's very hard to reach that, isn't it? I mean, you gave Horst Wächter every possible opportunity to change his mind or to open his mind, but he couldn't. So I wondered if you could reflect on that experience for you.
It's very complex. It's complex at a personal level because, of course, his father was responsible for acts which would have caused the deaths of my grandfather's entire family. But I think it's my training as an academic and also as a courtroom lawyer that you learn to try to strip personal emotions out. So at no point in the book, I mean, there is a moment in our relationship where I lost my rag with him and I'm not happy about that. But for the most part, I keep my own emotions in check, and we have a very good relationship and a very honest relationship. We disagree. And you'll have picked up from the book that in a curious way, I feel a degree of empathy and sympathy towards Horst. Why? Horst is firstly not responsible for what his father did. He was 5 years old in 1940. I mean, he was born in 39, so he was a kid. He has no responsibility at all. Nor is he a denier of the facts. He recognizes that Poles were killed, that millions of Jews were killed. He accepts the Holocaust happened. He thinks it's a terrible thing. He's not a denier. He doesn't even deny that his father had some role in those acts. What he won't accept is that his father was a criminal or a mass murderer. He says there's no evidence of that. And on that, he and I disagree. So if we go back to the letter that I mentioned a little earlier of December 1939, tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot, to give you a sense of Horst's intellectual processes. He takes that line, tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. And he says, you see, Philippe, he didn't want to kill them. He was told to do it. I have to do it. I've got no options. And that's the place of refuge in which he buries himself, I think, as a survival strategy. I think at the end of the day, he doesn't have a particular love for his father. He has a deep love for his mother, and his mother loved his father. And that becomes very clear because the archive that was shared with me includes material that Charlotte wrote or recorded in the 70s and 80s. She dies in 1985. And she spent the last 10 years of her life looking for old comrades and recording interviews with them, which she recorded. And amongst the material that Horst gave me were recordings of his mother with some of these old comrades or old Nazi journalists, the dreadful Melita Wiedemann. There's a recording in the Four Seasons Hotel in Munich in 1977, where you hear them toasting Adolf Hitler and clinking the glasses. And Charlotte says, I was a real supporter, real Nazi, the good old days. And Melita Wiedemann says, yes, so was I. And then it's slightly indistinct, but I think it's Charlotte who says, I still am, actually. And this is 1977. So, you know, deeply unrepentant, absolutely unrepentant. And Horst is just left completely immune to that kind of stuff. He loves his mum loved him, and he's going to look after his mum, and he's going to honor his mother, and that's all there is to it. And there is, frankly, no document I can show him. And of course, this is relevant, you know, to places today like Rwanda and Yugoslavia. Take Yugoslavia, I mean, the conflict between the Bosnians and the Serbs and the Croats. And you can, you know, spill out judgment after judgment from the Yugoslav tribunal saying all these terrible things that happened. And if people don't want to believe it, they won't believe it. And they won't believe it because it's a way of keeping their communities intact. It's a way of keeping their own lives intact. And we have to, as international lawyers, recognize the limits of what we engage in. We have to be engaged in history. We have to be engaged in psychology. We have to be engaged in literature. And we have to be engaged in politics. We can't treat the world only as we would like it to be, but as it really is. And Horst is part of a real world. And I can wish that it was otherwise, but it's not. He exists, and I have to take him as he is.
You referred actually recently in a Guardian article to Aung San Suu Kyi in connection with Charlotte and Horst, said she reminded you of them. Can you explain?
Yes, it was in the hearings last December. I'm counsel for the Gambia in the proceedings under the Genocide Convention of 1948 against Myanmar. And we were very surprised when Myanmar wrote to the court to say that the agent would be Aung San Suu Kyi, who of course is from your town, is from Oxford and lived in Oxford for I think more than 2 decades. Is very well known to many people. And she's a very eloquent speaker. She's a highly intelligent person. And she addressed the court, and she addressed the court very powerfully. But it was very striking to listen to her address the court as she refused to use the word Rohingya, failed to use the word rape, didn't address sexual assaults or sexual violence in the context of armed conflict, which was very distressing for a lot of the victims who were in the Peace Palace in the Great Hall of Justice. Very, very distressing indeed. And I was sitting there thinking, so what's actually going on here? Is it just politics? Can't be. She's, you know, someone who committed to human rights, got her doctorate, for her commitment to human rights. At Oxford in 2012, actually, John le Carre told me he was there with her. He got a doctorate from Oxford at exactly the same moment. And I think, to be honest, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychoanalyst, but I've talked with various people, and I think it's to do with her relationship with her father. Her father founded what is today the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar army. He died 2 years before Myanmar gained independence, while it was still Burma under British colonial rule. And she honors her father. She plainly loves her father. And it is her way of honoring her father as a future generation. And there will be no getting around it. I don't think there is anything the Tatmadaw could do, rather like Horst, that would persuade her that they've been engaged in wrongdoing, such as that to enable her to acknowledge it internationally. And we have to recognize the reality of communities. And it brings us back to the nature of the group and the individual. It brings us back to the distinction that I, explored in East-West Street between crimes against humanity, the protection of the individual, and genocide, the protection of the group. And in a sense, the feeling that almost all of us, if not all of us, have of kinship and identity with particular groups, with our family, with our street, with our town, with our football club, with our country, with the European Union, whatever it may be.
But add also the deeper purpose of international criminal law, and that it's not only serving the victims. In a sense, it's in the interests of people who, like Horst Wächter, who want to deny the reality of what's happened. Do you think it would have made a difference to him had his father faced trial and almost certainly been convicted?
Well, I think it would have, actually. I mean, he and I have spent hours debating. I mean, my view is very clear. If he'd been caught, he would have faced the same fate as Sai Singkwat and all of his mates. All of his mates either committed suicide or were hanged. I mean, literally without exception. He was top table Nazi, and that's what would have happened to him. He would have killed himself, or he would have been tried. He would have been convicted of crimes against humanity in Poland, of genocide also. And like, others, he would have been hanged. That's what would have happened. Horst denies it. Horst says there's no evidence he was involved. I don't think there's any document that I can show him that would persuade him that crimes had been committed by his father, because he doesn't want to believe it, because it is a manner of survival. And I think one of the takeaways that I get from this is that if you want to be, and this is for the students in the group who are watching, and there are many of you, if you want to be a good international lawyer, you have to engage with these other disciplines. We are not a narrow we are not a science. We are a social science, and we live in the world of human beings who are motivated for all sorts of reasons that cannot be simply explained. And the bottom line is, for Horst Wächter, his father was never tried, and he was therefore never convicted, and he is therefore an innocent man. And that raises, I think, some fundamental challenges about how we want to deal with international justice. Are courts the way forward, or do we want to find some other means?
Thank you, Philippe. I think that's a really good moment to open this up to questions. Kristin, I think you're going to take over at this point, aren't you?
Right, we have quite a number of questions. Some have been semi-answered, at least by your last comment regarding the view of Horst, of his father, or the fact that he was not prosecuted, and the importance of finding truth also at the personal level versus at the governmental level. When you were just mentioning the quest for justice and the many ways of looking for justice, so before I look to the question of the audience, I perhaps wanted to ask you, how do you see your book actually in this quest for justice? Do you see it as a sort of a step to bring Otto Wächter to justice in some way?
In a personal way, yes. He had been whitewashed out of history. And part of the project, but not a central part, but it's undoubtedly a sort of side benefit for me, is I wanted to put the spotlight on someone who had been involved in acts that caused great unhappiness to my grandfather, the loss of his entire family. Perhaps that was there behind the scenes. But in short, this is part of a bigger project, which is to reach the grand public, the ordinary intelligent reader, and let them understand the fundamental significance of international law. And one of the things that makes me incredibly happy with East-West Week, and the same thing seems to be happening with the Ratline, is the readership is vast. And people write to me incredible letters about how they didn't realize how fragile the system of international law was, how important it is, and why it needs to be protected. And that is the main heart of the project. It's sort of legal outreach, an academic who wants the world that he is engaged in to be understood by a bigger audience, because it's one thing for us to talk to each other, that's very important, but we need as international lawyers to reach a bigger audience. And of course, BIICL is part of that with these kinds of events, as it was with the COVID event. It's not good enough for us to talk only to ourselves. We have to reach out.
Absolutely. So now with a few questions from the audience, perhaps I'll start with one that considers your research. And David Snoxall wants to know what links did you come across between those sympathetic to the Nazis in the UK in the 30s, such as Unity and Diana Mitford, and your story. So this is a bit of a looking back questions.
Yeah. Hello, David. It's lovely that you're here, and I can't see you, but your presence is felt, and that's very nice that you're there. Well, of course, Charlotte Wächter loved Britain. Unbelievably, she came in 1925 for the first time. She was 18 years old. She was a troublemaker at school in Austria, so her parents decided what she needed was an English education. And they sent her to a girls' boarding school in Eastbourne, where she lived for a year. She loved it. We've got her papers from that. Those are amongst the papers. And she fell in love with England. And she stayed friends with her headmistress for the rest of her life, her headmistress's life. Her headmistress, incidentally, was the sister of Arthur Conan Doyle. And she kept coming back to England. She was a very fine designer of fabrics, Charlotte. And she'd come to England to sell her fabrics. And she writes a lot about that in her diaries. And she met Oswald Mosley, and she loved the British, and she stayed round the corner from BIICL at the Bonington Hotel on Southampton Row. Every time I go past the Bonington now, I think of Charlotte Wächter. It was her favorite hotel. I've got some of her headed notepaper from the 1930s. She would send letters to Otto from there. And one takeaway that I had is that, and she knew the Germans and she knew the Austrians, and she said, and this is ironic because I was writing at the time of Brexit, the most nationalist of all are the English. They know how to be real nationalists, unlike us Germans and us Austrians. And I thought that was extremely interesting. And I wondered quite how far that could go. So she was very connected with these people. Whether she met any of the Mitford sisters, I don't know, but I assume since she met Mosley, she must have met Mrs. Mosley, who was a Mitford sister. I always get confused as to the names of all of them. My wife is very partial to the Mitfords, and we've got all of their books, and she's much more knowledgeable than I am about them.
So another question, a more contemporary question. You hinted at the case of Myanmar before the ICJ, and someone is asking, what about what's happening in Syria? What are the avenues to prosecute, for example, armed groups, ISIS in Syria and Iraq? And of course, there are a number of obstacles, so perhaps you may want to comment on that and what is being done to bring those perpetrators to justice. Perhaps as a follow-up also to the Myanmar question, what I found quite extraordinary at the ICJ case is the fact that it's the Gambia versus Myanmar. So I don't know if you want to perhaps comment on the role of the Gambia and the fact that it's a country that is so far away from Myanmar that had to bring this case to the International Court.
Well, it's very simple. A magnificent Attorney General called Ba Tambadur, who's actually coincidentally one of my former students who studied in London, who went to BIICL. In fact, has offered to come and give a talk at BIICL. I've said I would do that with him when he's next in London. That, I should say, is not his first priority. His first priority is he wants to go to a football game at the Emirates Stadium. He's a mad keen Arsenal fan, but that's not going to happen for a very long time. So I suspect it will be BIICL first. And he had taken courses on these areas in the 90s, and then he became a prosecutor at the Rwanda Tribunal, and he went to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, and he went to the camps, and he firstly was horrified by what he saw, and secondly he said, I know genocide when I see it. And he had spent 10 years prosecuting genocides. He said, this is genocide. So he personally persuaded his president to do it. And of course, that became an issue because Myanmar grumbled and said, you have no right to be here. Who is the Gambia? Why are you here? What's your legal interest? And the court at the provisional measure stage said that is fine, although we need to be attentive. We all read the Chinese judge's separate opinion saying, there are some questions here. Why the Gambia? But one of the themes of my writing actually has been in both East-West Street and the Ratline that individuals make a real difference. You know, history is not made by states. History is made by individual human beings. And in the classroom, I'm very keen on that issue and our responsibilities as international lawyers. And that is a theme that emerges also in the Myanmar case. But for the Attorney General of the Gambia, this case would never have been brought. It is literally as simple as that. And he is an individual who saw something and acted on his instincts. Syria, it's not that nothing is happening. There are international fact-finding efforts. There is no international prosecution. But what is happening, and I find this absolutely fascinating, is that Germany is prosecuting, including for genocide, some of these individuals at the national level. How ironic that 75 years after the founding of the United Nations, a conference to which Germany was not invited and did not attend because the war had basically was still going on when that conference started, that it should be Germany that is now leading the world in prosecuting for these kinds of actions. Where is the United States? Where is the United Kingdom? Pretty much nowhere in real terms, in terms of these issues, putting forward a few initiatives, but not delivering like Germany is delivering. And again, it brings us back to the long arc of history that I think the narratives that have been told in Germany in particular have caused the prosecutor general in Germany, who I know, a man called Peter Frank, no relation to Hans Frank or Anne Frank, to have a personal sense of responsibility that when a person is found in the jurisdiction over which he has some authority, he will investigate, and if necessary, he will prosecute. And I find that completely admirable. But I think, as we know from the Pinochet case, which is where the third volume of this trilogy will go, justice is not fast. It operates sometimes rather slowly, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't operate.
So I'll end perhaps with a couple of more general questions about your book, the way it was received. You hinted at the burden of colonialism and the difficulty in opening up the discussion in this country. Somebody's asking if you're facing the same kind of pushback sometimes with your book, where people would perhaps say that you're opening old wounds and they have trouble to engage with the discussion. And then my final question will be actually the first question that came in, is what is going to be your next book if you're working already on another book?
Sure. So the old wounds issue is a very, I mean, these are all excellent questions. It's a very pertinent question. Yes, I mean, particularly at the family level. I mean, Horst has paid a big price for engaging with me. Most of the rest of his family have basically cut him off, because he has shone a spotlight. Even though he seeks to protect the name of the father, he has shone a spotlight, and that means that all the Wächters, and there were 6 children and there are 23 grandchildren, and, you know, presumably great-grandchildren will be on the way soon. So the Wächter line is spreading, and frankly, I would say not thrilled by this new attention. On the other hand, various members of the family have got in touch and have recognized that I'm trying to do this in a very correct way and in a very proper way. In terms of what comes next, just as Ratline is a quote-unquote sequel to East-West Street, Otto Wächter was a minor character in East-West Street. There is a minor character in the Ratline called Walter Rauff. Walter Rauff was living in Rome when, well, had just left Rome when Otto Wächter arrived in April 1949, and Otto Wächter is given the room that Rauff occupies at a monk's cell in the monastery of the Vigna Pia Monastery in Rome. And Rauff, who is an old comrade of Wächter's in the SS, an intelligence officer, also has fled to Syria. He lives there for a year. He then travels to South America. And then he arrives in Chile in 1955. And in 1973, it seems he became an advisor and an interrogator and possibly a torturer under the Pinochet regime. And of course, it's a way of bringing the story full circle, because in 1998, when Pinochet was arrested in London, I became involved in those proceedings. And at least one individual who was interrogated, allegedly by Walter Rauf, was had a role in those proceedings. He'd written an affidavit that reached the Spanish prosecutor. So there is an extraordinary sort of line of connections. It's 6 degrees of separation, 6 degrees of legal separation, I suppose. But that book won't come out for about 4 years. In the meantime, I'm bringing out a small book coming to what's happening now in Black Lives Matter. I'm going to write a short book. Well, I've almost finished it. Lockdown's been good for anything. It's writing time has been ample, no travel or anything, which is great. About Chagos, about the story of international law and decolonization from 1945 to 2020, 75 years, and in parallel, the story of a single person who was living on Chagos in 1973 and was removed by the British and wants to go back. A black woman who's now 75 years old, called Lisby Elise. Those of you who followed the Chagos case at the International Court closely will have perhaps seen her witness testimony, which was possibly one of the most remarkable moments I've ever witnessed in the Peace Palace in The Hague, where she spoke for 2.5 minutes and I think completely transformed a case. And I will tell her story. And that's complex because in the context of Black Lives Matter, there is a valid and legitimate question. Who am I, a privileged white male living in London, to tell the story of a black woman who was expelled by the United Kingdom from her home? She wants me to tell the story, and I'm working very, very closely with her and making sure that it is only her words that feature in that part of the story. But that is a legitimate question to ask. These things are sensitive and delicate, and I'm acutely aware of the sensitivities and will be consulting very widely to make sure I do the right thing in the manner in which I proceed. But it does seem that the timing is interesting because race has become a big issue now in Britain, and that will continue to be the case. I'm often asked, what is the difference between Chagos and the Falklands? Why were 2,000 people removed from the Chagos archipelago? Why are 2,000 people in the Falklands, Malvinas, given absolute protection by the United Kingdom? And I'm afraid that a part of the terrible answer to the question that is posed is that the Chagosians are black and the Falkland Islanders are white. And I think it's impossible to escape the reality of that fact. And we have to engage with it. And as international lawyers, we have to be courageous in engaging with the reality. And that includes being a white international lawyer.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions. I'll perhaps give the floor one more time to Rebecca. And
yes, that would be great.
Before I conclude, just to ask you, Rebecca, what is for you the main takeaway from the Ratline? I mean, I know you've reviewed it in the FT, but perhaps if you want to share with us what is your personal takeaway from the book?
Well, I think for me the really key thing was this extraordinary tension between the facts, you know, the truth, the objective reality, and as far as you could discern it, Philippe, and this just ingrained, entrenched resistance to take it on board by Horst Wächter. And I think that for me is so important to recognise that, as he said, you know, there is the law and what the law can do, and there are the kind of areas, the grey areas. There are the things that aren't black and white, the areas all between. And I think that, you know, the more we can actually engage with those between areas and try and actually deal with what's in those spaces, the better, really, in terms of moving beyond these kinds of appalling events that you describe.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you for having led the discussion so brilliantly. Thank you, of course, to you, Philippe, and thanks to all of you who have listened from near and from afar. We hope to see you again soon. If you are interested in questions of international criminal law, international justice more in general, actually, you may wish to sign up for our upcoming event on Myanmar, which is going to take place on the 24th of June. And of course, if you've enjoyed the seminar, please consider making a donation to BIICL. We're a charity, and we're hoping to be able to continue running these events for free and making them accessible to everyone for a very long time. So thank you all for your support, and I hope to see you again soon.